Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Johannes Ströbe. I'm a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business. And together with my colleague Teresa, I spend a lot of time thinking about how our social interactions shape our beliefs and our behavior. So for example, we have studied how your friends' housing market experiences affect your own home purchasing behavior. And one of the things we found was that when you have friends in faraway parts of the country where house prices have recently gone up, you're going to be much more optimistic about your own local housing market, and you're actually more likely to buy a house. We've also studied questions such as peer effect and product adoption decisions. So for example, when your friend gets a new phone, does that make you more likely to get a new phone? And does it make you more likely to get the specific phone that your friend got? And beyond these sort of consumption and investment decisions, social interactions have the potential to affect a whole load of outcomes that we care about. For example, one question that we're very interested in studying is whether or not having rich friends is important for a poor person's chances in life. And these questions aren't just interesting to economists, they're interesting to social scientists across the spectrum, all the way from sociologists to political scientists. And when you're trying to answer these questions empirically, one of the fundamental challenges we have is a measurement challenge. In order to study how your interactions with your friends affect your behavior, we need to know who your friends are. And in that context, online social networks such as Facebook provide a tremendous opportunity for researchers such as us to measure who your social network is, who your friends are, and subsequently try and understand the effect of your social interaction, of your social connectedness on these outcomes that we care about. And so today we want to talk to you about one project in this research agenda that we've been working on with researchers here in the core data science team at Facebook, and we call the project the Social Connectedness Index, or the SCI. What the SCI is, it's a measure of the social connectedness between regions. So you can think about this as the probability that a person, a Facebook user in County A, say San Francisco, is friends with or is connected with a Facebook user in another county, say San Francisco. And what's really interesting about this SCI data is you can then merge it at the geography level, at the region level with other data to study the extent to which social connectedness at least correlates with some of these outcomes we care about. So for example, you can match it with regional trade data to study whether two regions that are more socially connected are more likely to trade with each other. And so initially what we've done is we've put our focus on understanding the social connectedness of US counties as location, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But our hope is to sort of, in future work, roll this out to other locations, other geographies, for example, try and understand the social connectedness across different countries. And so in today's talk, we just want to show you a number of things that we've learned about the world from looking at this data. And one of the best ways to try and look at this is to start looking at some maps, right? So the maps I'm going to show you basically capture the social connectedness of a focal county with all of the other counties in the United States. So this here is an example that shows you a heat map of where people in San Francisco are connected to. And a few things jump out at you when you look at this. The first thing is that a lot of friends are local. Right? So if you look at San Francisco County, a lot of the social connections of people living in San Francisco County are all along the western coast of the United States. But you also notice these strong links to the northeastern United States, and you notice links to the tech hubs around Denver and around Austin. Right? So this is the social connectedness of San Francisco. Now let's compare that to the social connectedness of Kern County, California, which is home to the city of Bakersfield, just inland of LA. And what you can see is that the patterns look very different when you compare Kern County to San Francisco County. The first thing you notice is that much more of the social connectedness is local. There's much less connectedness to the northeast relative to what we saw in San Francisco. And so when you look at the numbers, you realize that people in Kern County have over half of their friends live within 50 miles of themselves, while that number is only 25% of friends when you look at people living in San Francisco County. But beyond this sort of bigger geographic concentration of the friendship links, there's a few other interesting patterns we noticed when we stared at this map. So the first one is, as you can see there, a strong cluster of friendship links to counties in North Dakota. Turns out that these counties are part of the Bakken oil fields. And so one of the things that, this might be surprising to you until you know that Kern County, California, is actually one of the largest oil-producing counties in the United States. And so we think that this cluster of connectedness is the result of very recent migration of oil workers from Kern County to work in the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota. Now, past migration is also going to be behind other patterns of social connectedness of Kern County that we observe. In particular, what you can see here is that there's another sort of cluster of social connections from people in Kern County to Oklahoma. right? And we think that those are the result of a much further in the past migration movements. In particular, in the 1930s, farmers in the Great Plains states, in particular in Oklahoma, were subject to an enormous environmental disaster called the Dust Bowl, which essentially made the land completely unfarmable. And so what happened in the 1930s is that these Dust Bowl migrants, as they were called, moved west, moved towards California, and a lot of them settled in Kern County. By the way, that's the migration, for those of you who are into country music, that allowed singers like Merle Haggard, who was born in Bakersfield, to sing about being a proud Okie from Muskogee. It's precisely those Dust Bowl migrants moving into California. And so what's interesting to us is that those migration movements, that more than 100 years, well, not more than 100, almost 100 years in the past, still show up strongly in terms of trying to explain social connectedness of US counties today. And there's other instances where we see these important past migration movements showing up in today's social connectedness. So here I'm showing you the social connectedness of Cook County, Illinois, which is home to the city of Chicago. And again, in addition to these strong friendship links to people nearby, you see this cluster of friendship links to the area around the Mississippi. And again, why do we think we see those links? We think those links are a historical remnant of the Great Migration. The Great Migration was a period when southern rural African Americans moved to northern industrial cities anywhere between the 1930s and the 1950s. And again, you can see these past migration movements showing up very, very strongly in trying to explain what parts of the US different counties are connected to. Here's another example that I found very interesting. So this is social connectedness of Menominee County, Wisconsin, which is home to the Menominee Indian Reservation. Right? And what you can see is that other parts of the map that light up here generally correspond to other Indian reservations in the US. So for example, this region here, which is in Arizona, those Arizona counties are part of the Navajo Nation. So what you can see is that different Indian reservations seem to be very, very strongly connected to each other, even sort of across pretty large distances. Here's another map that I found very interesting. It shows you the social connectedness of Erie County, New York, which is home to the city of Buffalo on the Great Lakes. And one thing that jumps out at you when you look at this map is how strongly the New York State outlines show up in this particular picture here. And that's not an exception when you look at Erie County. It's something that we see looking at many, many, many different counties. There seems to be something that makes social connectedness much stronger within US states than across US states line. And we have some theories of why that's going on, but we think that's a really fascinating pattern that I think needs to be understood better, and I think that this data allows us to shine some lights on. One other interesting thing from Erie County is those strong links down here to Florida. Those are not a surprise to anyone who's ever spent a winter day in Buffalo. It's very cold in Buffalo. It's very warm in Florida. And when you look at any of the sort of northeastern United States, you see in all of these places strong links to Florida, also to some extent to Arizona, the snowbirds, people trying to escape the cold, again fostering these connections here. So one thing that you can see across all of these pictures is how, how this data shows us that each county has a sort of social fingerprint that's the result of the past migration movement, past historical event, present-day economic conditions, and a lot of other things combined. And so we have a lot more that we learned from this, and I want to now pass you on to my colleague, Teresa, who will tell you about other things that we learned just from looking at this social connectedness index data. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Johannes. So Johannes just showed you how we see these connections drop oftentimes at state lines. But we also saw how sometimes people are connected across state lines, like we saw for San Francisco County, where residents have these strong connections up all the way to the Pacific coast. And so we were wondering, how can we kind of like explore this? How can we understand how much these state lines matter? And specifically, one question we were asking is, well, if we wanted to group the United States into a number of communities that maximized in-community connections, say, how would we assign states today if we wanted to form states that were maximally connected within each state? How would that look, and how would it look compared to the states that we actually see today? And so what we have here is we used a clustering algorithm to explore this question. And so we clustered the United States into 20 communities. And there are two interesting things that I think jump out from this. The first one is that all of the clusters are actually contiguous. And this is not something we required, but it is coming out of this fact that we saw before, that most people are very close friends to people around them. So we see these local connections. We also see that for many of these communities, state lines do jump out. And so most of them are divided along state lines, but there are a few exceptions. For instance, you can see here that like the Texas Panhandle actually gets grouped with Oklahoma and Arkansas instead of with Texas. And you can also see that little spot there, that's El Paso. That gets grouped to Arizona and New Mexico. And this is interesting if you know the history, because prior to the 1950 compromise, El Paso was actually part of New Mexico rather than of Texas. And you see that reflected here in those communities. In addition to looking at the connections within the US, we also wanted to explore how US residents are connected to different parts of the world. And so here what you see is a heat map of the connections of US counties to Mexico. Unsurprisingly, for Mexico, you see these strong connections across the border. In the southern border counties, where they're really strongly connected to Mexico, that makes sense, because that's where a lot of people actually maybe interact with Mexico, and where we have a lot of immigration. This is the same heat map for Norway. And Norway, I think, is interesting because you see those very strong friendships in the upper parts of the Midwest. And these were the areas where historically there was a lot of immigration from Norway to these parts of the country. Interestingly, though, this immigration took place in the late 19th century. So this is now over 100 years ago, and we still see these connections of those areas to Norway today. And it turns out that's actually something general we see in the data. And so there's many more about these international connections that I would love to show you, but unfortunately we don't have the time. So I'm going to cut it short and highly encourage you to look at our paper or at the data directly to see some of these related patterns. So what we've seen so far is how past migration and geography shape the social connections we see today. Another thing we wanted to explore was how do these social connections relate to outcomes that we might observe in the data. And so what we found is that counties where people have less geographically concentrated networks, so areas where people are more connected to more friends that are farther away, these are also the places where people are richer, where they live longer, and where they have higher social mobility. We also find that they trade more with each other, and this is true both for within US trade as well as for trade with other countries. And we find that they cite each other's patterns more heavily, indicating that there's also knowledge that's being distributed through these social networks. I want to point out that, of course, as with any empirical research, these correlations don't necessarily imply a causal relationship, but they are consistent with many of the economic theories or mechanisms that we might have in mind. For instance, this idea that information spreads through social networks and that these connections help facilitate the flow of information and innovation. And so we've shown you a bunch of outcomes that we've looked at, but of course there are many, many more. For instance, people have started looking at how to model contagious disease and how they spread in epidemiology, but we think there are many, many more questions. And so part of what we are trying to achieve is that maybe some of you can use this data to look into these questions. So one case I want to show you is a developer use case where developers, specifically Eric Berlow and Rich Williams, have used the SCI data to identify counties that might be particularly suitable for interventions to help foster bridge the political divide. And so they looked for areas where people in these areas were friends both with people in heavily Democratic counties as well as heavily Republican ones. And so they identified these areas and they called them bridging counties. The idea being that counties that are strongly connected to otherwise very polarized areas would be able to help bridge such a political divide. Here what you see is that one of those counties that they identified as being a very strong bridging county is Nassau County on Long Island in New York. And this is a county that had a very close margin in the last elections, slightly swinging Democratic. But it is very strongly connected to areas that were heavily Democratic, as well as to areas that were heavily Republican. And so their idea was that this might help identify such areas where we could intervene, where people in these areas could help bring people of different political ideology together and bridge these differences. Well, we hope that eventually we can make our data be part of Facebook's standard data release products, for instance, via the Data for Good initiative. For now, if you're interested in working with this data, all you have to do is just send a short description, really a less than one-page proposal of your idea to SEI_data@facebook.com, and then hopefully you'll be able to work with this data. And since we think that there's so many interesting questions to explore, we're really looking forward to seeing how some of you might use this data to learn more about the world around us and our social connections. Thank you very much.